Hello 5A, hope you're well. I'm going to carry on reading chapter 8 of Howl's Moving Castle. As usual, there is a link in the bottom if you're looking on that page. Chapter 8 starts on page 38. Chapter 8, in which Sophie leaves the castle in several directions at once. To Sophie's relief, Calcifer blazed up bright and cheerful the next morning. If she had not had enough of Howl, she would almost certainly be touched by how glad Howl was to see Calcifer. "I thought she'd done for you, you old ball of gas," said Howl, kneeling at the hearth with his sleeves trailing in the ash. "I was only tired," Calcifer said. "There was some kind of drag on the castle. I'd never taken it that fast before." "Well, don't let her make you do it again," said Howl. He stood up, gracefully brushing ash off his grey and scarlet suit. "Make a start on that spell today, Michael, and if anyone comes from the king, I'm away on urgent private business until tomorrow. I'm going to see Letty, but you needn't tell him that." He picked up his guitar and opened the door with the knob green down, out onto the wide, cloudy hills. The Scarecrow was there again. When Howl opened the door, it pitched sideways across him with its turnip face in his chest. The guitar uttered an awful twang-oing sound. Sophie gave a faint squawk of terror and hung onto the chair. One of the Scarecrow's stick arms was scraping stiffly around, trying to get a purchase on the door. From the way Howl's feet were braced, it was clear he was being shoved quite hard. There was no doubt the thing was determined to get into the castle. Calcifer's blue face leaned against the grate. Michael stood stock still and beyond. "There really is a Scarecrow," they both said. "Oh, is there? Do tell," Howl panted. He got one foot up against the doorframe and heaved. The Scarecrow flew lumpishly away backwards, to land with a light rustle in the heather some yards off. It sprang up instantly and came hopping towards the castle again. Howl hurriedly laid the guitar on the doorstep and jumped down to meet it. "No, you don't, my friend," he said with one hand out. "Go back to where you came from." And he walked forward still with his hand out. The Scarecrow retreated a little, hopping slowly and warily backwards. When Howl stopped, the Scarecrow stopped too, with its one leg planted in the heather and its ragged arms tilting this way and that like a person sparring for an opening. The rags fluttering on its arms seemed a mad imitation of Howl's sleeves. "So, you won't go," Howl said, and the turnip head slowly moved from side to side. "No." "I'm afraid you'll have to," Howl said. "You scare Sophie, and there's no knowing what she'll do when she's scared. Come to think of it, you scare me too." Howl's arms moved heavily as if he was lifting a large weight, until they were raised high above his head. He shouted a strange word which was half hidden in a crack of sudden thunder, and the Scarecrow went soaring away. Up and backward it went, rags fluttering, arms wheeling in protest, up and out and on, until it was a soaring speck in the sky, then a vanishing point in the clouds, and then not to be seen at all. Howl lowered his arms and came back to the doorway, mopping his face on the back of his hand. "I take back my hard words, Sophie," he said, panting. "That thing was alarming. It must have been dragging the castle back all yesterday. It had some of the strongest magic I've met. Whatever was it? All that was left of the last person you cleaned for?" Sophie gave a weak little cackle of laughter. Her heart was behaving badly again. Howl realised something was wrong with her. He jumped indoors across his guitar, took hold of her elbow, and sat her in the chair. "Take it easy now." Something happened between Howl and Calcifer then. Sophie felt it, because she was being held by Howl and Calcifer was still leaning out of the grate. Whatever it was, her heart began to behave properly again almost at once. Howl looked at Calcifer, shrugged and turned away to give Michael a whole lot of instructions about making Sophie keep quiet for the rest of the day. Then he picked up the guitar and left at last. Sophie lay in the chair and pretended to feel twice as ill as she did, but she had to let Howl get out of sight. It was a nuisance. He was going to Upper Folding as well, but she would walk so much more slowly that she would arrive about the time he started back. The important thing was not to meet him on the way. She watched Michael slyly while he spread out his spell and scratched his head over it. She waited until he dragged big leather books off the shelves and began making notes in a frantic, depressed sort of way. When he seemed properly absorbed, Sophie muttered several times, "Oh, stuffy in here." Michael took no notice. "Terribly stuffy," Sophie said, while getting up and shambling to the door. "Fresh air." She opened the door and climbed out. Calcifer obligingly stopped the castle dead while she did. Sophie landed in the heather and took a look around to get her bearings. The road over the hills to Upper Folding was a sandy line through the heather, just downhill from the castle. Naturally, Calcifer would not make things inconvenient for Howl. Sophie set off towards it. She felt a little sad. She was going to miss Michael and Calcifer. She was almost at the end of the road when there was shouting behind her. Michael came bounding down the hillside after her, and the tall black castle came bobbling along behind him, shedding anxious puffs of smoke from all four turrets. "What are you doing?" Michael said when he caught up. From the way he looked at her, Sophie could see he thought the scarecrow had sent her wrong in the head. "I'm perfectly all right," Sophie said indignantly. "I'm simply going to see my other sister's granddaughter. She's called Letty too. Now, do you understand?" "Where does she live?" Michael demanded, as if he thought she might not know. "Upper Folding," said Sophie. "But that's over 10 miles away," Michael said. "I promised Howl I'd make you rest. I can't let you go. I told him I wouldn't let you out of my sight." Sophie did not look very kindly on this. Howl thought she was useful now because he wanted her to see the king. Of course, he did not want her to leave the castle. "Huh," she said. "Besides," said Michael, slowly grasping the situation, "Howl must have gone to Upper Folding too." "I'm quite sure he had," said Sophie. "Then you're anxious about this girl." "She's your great niece," Michael said, arriving to the point at last. "I see, but I can't let you go." "I'm going," said Sophie. "But if Howl sees you there, he'll be furious," Michael went on, working things out. "Because I promised him he'll be mad with both of us. You ought to rest." Then, when Sophie was almost ready to hit him, he exclaimed, "Wait! There's a pair of 7-league boots in the broom cupboard." He took Sophie by her skinny old wrist and towed her up to the waiting castle. She was forced to give little hops in order not to catch her feet in the heather. "But," she panted, 7 leagues is almost 21 miles. I'll be halfway to Porthaven in 2 strides. "No, it's 10.5 miles a step," said Michael. "That makes Upper Folding almost exactly. If we each take 1 boot and go together, then I won't be letting you out of my sight. You won't be doing anything strenuous, and we'll get there before Howl does, so he won't even know we've been. That solves all our problems beautifully." Michael was so pleased with himself, Sophie didn't have the heart to protest. She shrugged and supposed Michael had better find out about the 2 Lettys before they changed looks again. It was more honest this way. But when Michael fetched the boots from the broom cupboard, Sophie began to have doubts. Up to now, she thought they were 2 leather buckets that had somehow lost their handles and got a bit squashed. "You're supposed to put your foot in them, shoe and all," Michael explained as he carried the two heavy bucket-shaped things to the door. "These are the prototypes of the boots Howl made for the king's army. We managed to get the later ones a bit lighter and more boot-shaped." He and Sophie sat on the doorstep and each put 1 foot in a boot. "Point yourself towards Upper Folding before you put the boot down," Michael warned her. He and Sophie stood up on the foot of what was an ordinary shoe, which was in an ordinary shoe, and carefully swung themselves around to Upper Folding. "Now tread," said Michael. Zip! The landscape instantly rushed past them, so fast it was only a blur, a grey-green blur for the land and a blue-grey blur for the sky. The wind of their going tore at Sophie's hair and dragged every wrinkle in her face backwards until she thought she'd arrive with half her face behind each ear. The rushing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Everything was calm and sunny. They were knee-deep in buttercups in the middle of Upper Folding village common. A cow nearby stared at them. Beyond it, thatched cottage drowsed under trees. Unfortunately, the bucket-like boot was so heavy that Sophie staggered as she landed. "Don't put that foot down," Michael yelled, too late. There was another zip and blur and more rushing wind. And when it stopped, Sophie found herself right down in the Folding Valley, almost into Marsh Folding. "Oh, drat," she said, and hopped carefully round on her shoe and tried again. Zip, blur, and she was back on Upper Folding Green again, staggering forward with the weight of the boot. She had a glimpse of Michael diving and trying to catch her. Zip! "Oh, bother," wailed Sophie. She was up in the hills again. The crooked black shape of the castle was drifting peacefully nearby. Calcifer was amusing himself, blowing smoke rings from one turret. Sophie saw that much before her shoe caught in the heather. Sophie saw that much before her shoe caught in the heather, and she stumbled forward again. Zip, zip! This time, Sophie visited in rapid succession the market square of Market Chipping and the front lawn of a very grand mansion. "Blow!" she cried out. "Drat!" One word for each place. And she was off again with her own momentum, and another zip down at the end of the valley on a field somewhere. A large red bull raised its ringed nose from the grass and thoughtfully lowered its horns. "I'm just leaving, my good beast," Sophie cried, hopping herself around frantically. Zip! Back to the mansion. Zip! Market Square. Zip! There was the castle again. She was getting the hang of it. Zip! Here was Upper Folding, but how did you stop? Zip! "Oh, confound it," Sophie said, almost in Marsh Folding again. This time she hopped round very carefully and trod with great deliberation. Zip! Unfortunately, the boot landed in a cow pat and she sat down with a thump. Michael sprinted up before Sophie could move and dragged the boot off her foot. "Thank you," Sophie cried breathlessly. "There seemed no reason why I should ever stop." Sophie's heart pounded a bit as they walked across the common to Mrs. Fairfax's house, but only in the way hearts do when you've done rather a lot rather quickly. She felt very grateful for whatever Howl and Calcifer had done. "Nice place," Michael remarked as he hid the boots in Mrs. Fairfax's hedge. Sophie agreed. The house was the biggest in the village. It was thatched with white walls between the black beams, and Sophie remembered the visits as a child. You walked up to the porch through a garden crowded with flowers and humming with bees. Over the porch honeysuckle and a white climbing rose were competing as to which could give the most work to the bees. It was a perfect, hot summer morning down here in Upper Folding. Mrs. Fairfax answered the door herself. She was one of those plump, comfortable ladies, with swathes of butter-coloured hair coiled around her head, who made you feel good with life just to look at her. Sophie felt the tiniest bit envious of Letty. Mrs. Fairfax looked round from Sophie to Michael. She'd seen Sophie last a year ago as a girl of 17, and there was no reason to recognise her as an old woman of 90. "Good morning to you," she said politely. Sophie sighed. Michael said, "This is Letty Hatter's great-aunt. I brought her to see Letty." "Oh, I thought your face looked familiar," Mrs. Fairfax exclaimed. "There's quite a family likeness. Do come in. Letty's a little bit busy just now, but has some scones and honey while you wait." She opened her front door wider. Instantly, a large collie dog squeezed past Mrs. Fairfax's skirts, barged between Sophie and Michael, and ran out across the nearest flower bed, snapping off flowers right and left. "Oh, stop him," Mrs. Fairfax gasped, flying off in pursuit. "I don't want him out just now." There was a minute or so of helter-skelter chase in which the dog ran hither and thither, whining in a disturbed way, and Mrs. Fairfax and Sophie ran around after the dog, jumping flower beds and getting in one another's way, and Michael ran after Sophie, crying, "Stop, you'll make yourself ill." Then the dog set off, loping around one corner of the house. Michael realised the way to stop Sophie was to stop the dog. He made a crosswise dash through the flower beds, plunged around the house after the dog, and seized it by two handfuls of its thick coat, just as it reached the orchard at the back. Sophie hobbled up to find Michael pulling the dog away backwards and making such strange faces at her, she thought at first he was ill. But he jerked his head so often towards the orchard, She realised he was trying to tell her something. She stuck her face round the corner of the house, expecting to see a swarm of bees. Howl was sitting there with Letty. They were in a grove of mossy apple trees in full bloom, with a row of beehives in the distance. Letty sat in a white garden seat. Howl was kneeling on one knee in the grass at her feet, holding one of her hands and looking noble and ardent. Letty was smiling lovingly at him. But the worst of it, as far as Sophie was concerned, was that Letty did not look like Marta at all. She was her own extremely beautiful self. She was wearing a dress of the kind of same pinks and whites as the crowded apple blossom overhead. Her hair trailed in glossy curls over one shoulder, and her eyes shone with devotion for Howl. Okay, I'm going to stop there because there's something I need to do, but I'll do this video in 2 parts.